Just ahead on Washington to Washington.
I do think that we're going to be talking about the pandemic and pandemic kids for their entire lives.
Failing test scores and declining enrollments.
We lost 1,000 students. We've never had that happen before.
Public education since the pandemic is at a crossroads.
I think once the pandemic hit, I changed my views also on what education should be.
In the nation's capital, billions in federal money sent to states to help out schools.
Our job is to look at how that money is being used, to monitor that money.
How challenging is it to sort of get a full picture of how each state is using the Esser money?
It's very challenging.
School districts are hoping the money will help students, knowing it won't be there forever.
What happens when the federal money runs out?
Use the federal money almost as an incubation of innovation. Test it for a year or two, knowing the money's going to go away.
Meanwhile, one school in Washington state is getting national recognition for turning around graduation rates during the pandemic.
The truth of the matter is if you find meaning in what you do, then you have a purpose for completing, right?
From the capital of Washington state to the capital of the United States, this is Washington to Washington. Hello and welcome to Washington. I'm Jennifer Huntley in Washington State, where students are heading back to the classroom this fall for the start of the school year. It's been nearly 3 years since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Many expected it to be behind us by now, and while life is returning to a new normal, the virus is lingering with new variants that bypass previous infections and vaccines. But it isn't the virus causing most of the disruption for schools. Declining enrollment has had a big impact on funding for public schools, and K-12 enrollment is expected to remain about 40,000 students below 2016 levels through at least 2025. In 2021, enrollment declined by nearly 4% due to concerns over COVID and remote hybrid learning. That's about $600 million lost in state funding for Washington schools. Why do enrollment numbers matter? Well, it's a big part of how schools pay the bills. Schools are funded per student. On average, schools in Washington get about $12,000 per student from the state. So how are schools in Washington state handling the loss in enrollment? An unprecedented $190 billion in federal aid for states is helping, but that's one-time money that will run out. Meanwhile, the data shows many students who are still enrolled in regular school are struggling. The state superintendent's office released data showing that last fall, 70% of students failed to meet the state standard in math and 52% of students failed the standard in English language arts. Our goal for this episode is to gain a deeper understanding of why students are struggling, what educators are doing to get students back on track, and how the federal relief money is being spent here in Washington state and across the country. We begin with State Schools Superintendent Chris Reichdahl. We're ready. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us on Washington. We sat down with him one-on-one and talked about everything from the use of federal money in the state to enrollment declines to the lasting effects of COVID on public education. First off, what are the top priorities that you want school districts to focus on for students and staff in the classroom?
Well, it's always about safety, and there's a reason for that, obviously. We want kids to be safe, we want families, but also confidence. When students come in and safety is almost an afterthought, I mean, they're conscious about it, but feeling like, hey, I get to go to school and it's awesome, then they're having fun, and when they feel safe and they're having fun and they enjoy the experience, then the learning follows.
Some districts have hired additional administrative staff at a time when they're facing reductions due to a drop in enrollment. How would you assess the use so far of the federal Esser money here in Washington state and how districts have prioritized spending?
Well, it came in phases. First off, it was all about PPE. It was about equipment, safety, testing. It was all about those protocols, and that is very much building level administrator stuff. How do we make sure that we can keep schools open or reopen them? And then it is phased very, very rapidly to how do we do interventions and supports for kids. This is intended to be over 3 or 4 years. It will take that long to really understand and intervene.
Needs have shifted over time as more students are back in class and districts are trying to, catch students up after a year of learning loss. How can both state and federal funds be used by districts to sort of stay on top of the challenges and shift when needed? How should local districts respond to the changing needs of students?
Well, it is always about knowing your community, knowing your students. We do some of that through very formal cognitive assessment, usually in math and English language arts and some other content areas. And then it's very much about knowing their social emotional needs. This state invests a whole lot more than the feds do on all of those subjects. Right? I mean, our federal money is typically 5 or 6% of our budgets. It's ballooned up in the short term due to the federal emergency relief fund, so it's helpful and it's been important. But we have ongoing ways of doing this work and intervening, including a significant learning assistance program. And then the other challenge, of course, is when you get an infusion of federal money, we've been very cautious to tell districts, don't tie yourself to permanent obligations because it's going to go away. So you can't spike services and then have them go away if you can't sustain them. So they're being very, very careful about that.
That was going to be one of my next questions. What happens when the federal money, runs out? Should local school districts, like you said, be planning with finding other ways to fund the programs that might be started with this Esser money?
Use the federal money almost as an incubation of innovation. Test it for a year or two, knowing the money's going to go away. And as you get success, take all that underlying state funds that you have and start to move your programming in that direction. That's the goal. Jumpstart camps, doing math interventions in the summer, really doing that summer learning impact remediation. Where it's successful, we'll go to the legislature and say, even the underlying money won't quite get it done, can you make it permanent? But we're not going to the legislature to ask them to make permanent $3 billion federal dollars. They are 99% of those are going to come and go and not be replaced.
I want to talk a little bit about enrollment issues within the state. Many districts are facing low enrollment, in turn cutting teachers and programs, resulting in higher class sizes, which will of course have a direct impact on student learning at a really critical time during this pandemic. This year, the legislature appropriated about $280 million in enrollment stabilization funds for districts across the state. How are those dollars reaching school districts, and what impact might they have on proposed reductions that districts are now putting out?
The impact from enrollments is about $600 million. If you just calculate the 4% of students who aren't enrolled, and we're recovering already, but it's considered about $600 million. The legislature put half of it in and they said it's one time. So candidly, it won't have much impact. That money will allow us to keep some educators longer, keep some paraeducators a little longer. They're going to use those federal emergency dollars to keep them as long as they can, and then they're trying to essentially get themselves through the next 2 or 3 years for enrollment recovery. But one-time money does not sustain school districts.
Finally, how do you think COVID has affected public education, and what do you think the lasting effects will be?
I hope the lasting effects are just how much we utilize that system to democratize learning. So we don't put the expectation in the state of Washington, the United States, on families to say, come up with $16,000 every year to educate your child. We instead build systems of support, regardless of your zip code or income. I think we realize that two-income households are desperate for public education to be an effective and safe and consistent service for them.
Research from the past few years shows reopening schools as soon as possible had a clear impact on student success. A report by a group of education researchers found that students that spent the most time in online learning during the pandemic ended up with greater learning loss than students who went back to class in person earlier. It also found that students in high poverty schools were hit the hardest, with greater impacts on their education. Learning gaps were larger in states with the most remote instruction. And here's another finding. While high school graduation rates didn't change much, many of those graduates chose to delay starting college. It is clear COVID has taken a toll on public schools, including on their reputation. A recent Gallup poll revealed that just 28% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in public schools, the second lowest figure on record. As districts work to rebuild confidence, some are finding creative ways to re-engage students and families. We visited one program in the North Thurston School District near Olympia that is focused on creating a partnership with parents to support learning in school and at home.
Hi! Good to see you.
Ignite Family Academy in Lacey, Washington may look like any other public school coming back to life after a pandemic shuttered buildings more than 2 years ago. But spend more time here.
That one doesn't have to go all the way in because that will go in when so it's fine.
And you'll find a less traditional learning environment with small classes, lots of extracurricular learning, and students arriving from home at different times throughout the day to attend class. That's because Ignite is a family partnership program. Stephanie Hollinger is the principal.
I would say a huge chunk of our families have come to us because of the pandemic. They were looking for different options. Many parents are wanting to homeschool, but they don't want to be on their own.
Hollinger was hired in April of 2021. Her goal to open the school by September of that year.
We provide in-person classes less frequently than kids would go to traditional school, but they still get a chance to come in, be social with others, learn from a teacher in a physical environment.
30 students signed up when the doors opened. By the end of the school year, 44 more had joined. When we interviewed Hollinger last spring, 10 new families had already committed to begin class in the fall, and the district has plans to build a new building nearby for a future campus.
We were so thrilled to find Ignite.
Jennifer Barton, her husband, and 2 kids moved to Washington State from Colorado, where their kids attended a neighborhood elementary school.
And then the pandemic came along right at the end of my son's 5th grade year. And much like other families, we were slapped in the face with a new reality. And we really tried to roll with it.
But then middle school started for her son, entirely online.
It was a real tough transition, and for us, it really was the inspiration to consider homeschooling as an alternative to traditional school.
Moving to Washington State to be closer to family, the Bartons plan to continue homeschooling, but we're looking for support from a school district.
And then you have this.
And then we have a partnership here that really does supplement and fill in a lot of the areas that maybe we couldn't provide at home.
Jennifer's daughter, Elise, agrees.
It's amazing. Usually people go here twice a week. I go here 4 times a week.
Katie Tingle.
Teacher Katie Tingle works with a cohort of kindergarten through 2nd grade students. Before this, all she had known was teaching in a traditional classroom.
I think once the pandemic hit, I changed my views also on what education should be. And here, I feel like I can meet the needs of students, and the needs are changing, so we have to change with it.
It appears families statewide agree with her assessment. Enrollment in alternative learning environments like Ignite has increased. When schools closed in March of 2020, there were more than 38,000 students enrolled in ALEs statewide. By 2022, that number grew to more than 57,000. Offering an alternative isn't just for pleasing pandemic-anxious parents. There's no doubt it also brings in funding that otherwise would be lost if those students stayed home.
When the pandemic first hit in 2020, as we started the next school year, we lost 1,000 students. We've never had that happen before.
North Thurston School Superintendent Deborah Clemens says the enrollment decline helped drive North Thurston to look for solutions.
Our first commitment is to serving our students and families. And as families were choosing to homeschool their children, we heard from them about how they had needs because they had never homeschooled before. And so that outreach made us aware we needed to provide some services. So that really was the reason that we started to look at Ignite Family Academy.
North Thurston receives about $9,000 from the state for every student attending school within the district, but alternative learning schools like Ignite also bring in state money per student. The district receives about $8,700 for each child enrolled. As districts work to keep money within the public school system, educators hope the pandemic brings the same shift in creative thinking to lawmakers both here and in D.C.
I think the federal government, too, also recognizing just how important non-traditional education is. And I think after the pandemic as well, people are really thinking outside the box now more than ever.
When we come back,
we are in a pretty deep academic hole.
The federal side of the story. Congress hopes billions in aid will be enough to provide relief to school districts. But how long will it last? And what are we learning about how the money is being spent?
Hearing terminology like level 1, 2, and 3 evacuations, that's somewhat of a foreign term on this side of the state.
We're waiting on engine 5-9.
The ability for us to stop all forest fires, it's just not realistic.
When I showed up, there were dead bees everywhere. What the heck happened?
Welcome back. The amount of money from the federal government to help with COVID relief in the nation's schools is unprecedented. Nearly $190 billion sent to states in 3 installments. The first one came as the world was shutting down in March of 2020. Congress passed the CARES Act. About $13 billion went to states for local school districts. The emergency money mostly paid for PPE, air filtration systems, cleaning, and technology, while schools were shifting to remote learning. Several months later, in December 2020, Congress passed an additional $54 billion for education. The third installment came in 2021 when Congress passed the American Rescue Act in March of that year. Within weeks of the president signing it into law, an additional $122 billion was distributed among states for local school districts. States have until September 2024 to spend the final allotment of funds. While the money is welcomed, it is also a tall order to track nationwide how it is being spent.
Our job is to look at how that money is being used, to monitor that money.
When the U.S. Department of Education Deputy Secretary Cindy Martin visited Washington State in the spring of 2022, she was looking to get a good picture into how the state was spending a portion of the billions in federal aid sent to education districts nationwide to help schools come back after the pandemic.
When I go out to districts and states, I meet with state officials, district officials, and they're very clear on how they're using the dollars and the impacts that they're expecting to have on the use of these dollars.
Each state was required to send the U.S. Department of Education their plans on how they would use federal funds to reopen and provide academic and mental health support to students. Those plans were approved in 2021, but the federal government expects states to adjust those plans as time goes on.
So we are able to look at that in an accountability kind of way. Accountability and transparency matters, and we start with the state plans that have been submitted to us, where there's commitment to how the dollars are being spent, and then ongoing monitoring of those dollars to make sure they're being spent as intended.
While districts continue to complain about enrollment declines, which directly impact state funding, Martin is confident students will come back to public school again.
They're coming back, and as they come back, they really will come back when you build the programs that will serve them best.
How challenging is it to sort of get a full picture of how each state is using the Esser money?
It's very challenging because every state is unique, right? I mean,
Democratic Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland took office in January 2021. While she may be relatively new in D.C., she's uniquely positioned to understand how local communities spend federal dollars. She was mayor of Tacoma for 8 years, and before that, a member of the Tacoma City Council.
I would say that's always a challenge when you send large tranches of money to local government. On the one hand, you want to make sure that there's accountability, but you don't want the administrative part of it to be so cumbersome that it's not worth getting the funding.
Strickland says part of the problem lies with how states have funded schools for years, relying mostly on state funds and local levies, a funding model that many say has resulted in unequal public education.
It's nuts. I mean, it's just piecemeal. It comes from here or there. It's not equitable because different districts have different property values.
As for the big question of whether the largest influx of federal money for education will make a difference, data on how it is working is crucial.
What are trends that we're seeing? Where are there gaps? How can we be more intentional about helping different communities? And so I'm a big fan of collecting data. I think it's important, but at the same time, I also know that that is a monumental task that could be very expensive.
There is no doubt that tracking data is expensive and complicated. But those who do the work say it's critical to making sure help gets to students and communities who need it most.
I think that we all need to have an urgency around academic recovery.
Dr. Dan Goldhaber is director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington, as well as the director of the Calder Research Center, a partnership between researchers at 11 universities nationwide that study education data.
Can we talk sample selection in like 10 minutes? Yep. Okay.
Bottom line, Goldhaber uses data to compile a picture of the U.S. public education system. Based on his research, Goldhaber and his colleagues are offering up some of the earliest views into the impact of COVID-19 on the nation's schools. One key finding, the speed at which schools returned to in-person learning was a key factor in how far students fell behind.
I would say The depth of the academic problem, it's hard to overstate it.
Goldhaber and his team originally hoped to get more detailed information from the federal government regarding how the money would be spent by states.
We kind of expected that the rules, the federal rules, would have perhaps more guidelines around the way the money was being spent, and we could track the spending in a way that would allow us to assess the efficacy of the initiatives.
The states were given more freedom to determine spending, with the idea that in order to get the money out fast, fewer regulations from the feds would be needed. So the researchers looked through the state plans.
And for the most part, the state plans didn't have enough detail to really be able to assess the kinds of initiatives at the ground level.
They crunched data from more than 2 million students in 10,000 elementary and middle schools. They studied everything from teacher preparation and retention during the pandemic to student achievement. While learning loss looks different from district to district, figuring out why isn't a simple task.
Some of that is explained by the degree to which schools were remote during the pandemic, and some of it we really can't explain.
Goldhaber hopes educators can use the report to gain insight into what their district should focus on to help students.
We're learning that it's probably really important for districts to have a good assessment of where their students are at so that they can target the really unprecedented amount of federal money that's available for COVID academic recovery appropriately.
The challenge is to understand quickly what programs are most helpful in order to have any impact on current students.
The history of education research shows that, in fact, most reforms are not successful. So we should be looking at all the myriad initiatives that districts are implementing really with a realistic eye to think that a lot of them are going to fail, and we want to be able to tell districts what's working and what's not working in as close to real time as possible.
While schools work to determine what initiatives are most effective, researchers are clear that students who were behind before the pandemic are, in many cases, worse off today. But we found one school here in Washington State that is getting national attention for reaching milestones over the past few years.
It was really scary.
When the pandemic shut down schools, Dolores Sanchetta was like any other parent, concerned for her elementary and high school age boys and worried about how she could continue working and make sure her own children stayed on track in online school.
I literally would walk upstairs and they'd both be asleep on the couch with their laptop on, teacher talking. And I'm like, okay, this ain't working, guys, you know?
She was particularly anxious about her older son, Moses.
He was getting to that point where he was like, I'm just done. I don't want to do this. This is dumb. Just get my GED. I've always told my kids since they were young, that wasn't an option. You had to graduate.
Anchetta was 17 and in the 11th grade when she got pregnant with her daughter. She knew back then she had to graduate.
That was literally the first year that I had all A's, and I was breastfeeding her, and I graduated when she was 6 months old.
If she could graduate as a new mom, Anchetta didn't want the pandemic to prevent her son from that same milestone. But Anchetta had concerns about other students as well. That's because she works in outreach for Chief Leshai Schools, the same school she graduated from more than 20 years ago. Leshai is the largest Bureau of Indian Affairs school in the Puyallup Tribe of Nations, with about 670 students in grades pre-K through 12th grade. Almost all of the students are tribal.
A lot of the kids respect us that way, and they come to us and they trust us, and they actually care about us and we care about them.
Before COVID, students were bused from all over, including King and Thurston County, making the shutdowns all the more isolating. Elders in the community got COVID and died. Leshai's attendance numbers dropped from 88% in the 2019-20 school year to a little over 70% the following year. Graduation rates at the school were low before COVID. Students like Archetta's son were at risk of not graduating, but the school's administration got to work.
We've got many generations of graduates here.
Just months before the pandemic, Superintendent Mark Brulette began his first year at the district. His administration was already looking at major changes to improve student success and graduation rates. Administrators had begun a new program called Student Success. Employees like Anchetta would serve as a contact between families and the school.
They have great relationships in the community. They are well known. They knew most of the families or grandparents or brothers or sisters, and so that gave us a connection point into the homes of our students so that they could be accountable.
The first set of federal relief money went to purchase laptops for every student.
Because of our size, we didn't have to have 20,000 devices. We only needed 700 devices to make sure all of our students had a device to use.
A Career and Technical Education Program, or CTE, allowed students to participate in internships in entertainment, culinary, medical, and environmental sciences. Janine Medvedich is the Chief Academic Officer.
The truth of the matter is if you find meaning in what you do, then you have a purpose for completing. So I think that when we have powerful opportunities like CTE, they say, oh, now I understand how the math and the science and all of these pieces, these classes are going to tie in to doing something that I want to do well beyond high school.
Longtime Chief Leshai employee and alumni Bina Macleod is the Director of Student Success and Culture.
If one of us call, they go, oh, what did he do now? Or what did she do now? I'll talk to him when I get home. And so that was really the important component for student success, that we could have that constant communication with families.
With a strategy to improve, the Student Success Program shifted to more home visits. All the while, the administration's goal was to increase graduation rates. And despite COVID, that happened. The school's graduation rates went from 70% in spring of 2019 to 92% in spring of 2021. And in spring 2022, Moses Moody, Anchetta's son, graduated.
I couldn't really do it without support. My mom and my girlfriend, they really helped me push through, getting through the year.
Moses graduated. How'd you feel? What was that?
Oh man, I was ecstatic. My oldest I graduated from Chief Leshai, my daughter graduated from Chief Leshai, and now my son is, and my youngest will be on the same road. So it was huge.
Weeks earlier, another dream was realized. Moses became the state champion in track and field, 110-meter hurdles. At a time when the nation's public education system is on a long road to recovery, Moody's success and the success of Chief Leshai schools is a win worth celebrating, one the Federal Bureau of Indian Education wanted to know more about.
They asked us to please share what it was that contributed to all of the success.
When we got the community all together, working together with your leadership and with your parents and the school and the different programs that are open to our internships, how can we not be successful?
Of course, the goal is to maintain that success. When the Bureau of Indian Education first learned of the school's graduation rate increase, they planned to take away special grant funding that had been designated for low graduation rate schools. But now the Bureau has agreed to continue funding the grant and is having Medvedich make presentations to other tribal schools to share their success. On the next Washington to Washington.
What we do in school isn't just about math and science and English and social studies. It's about how are you developing and how do we quiet that noise long enough for you to discover who you are.
That's a lot on schools.
It is, and getting more complicated every year.
We will continue our look at public education during the pandemic with a focus on mental health. How serious is the problem for our nation's children? And what roles should public schools play in providing help for students who are struggling? For now, from Washington State, thank you for watching. We hope you'll join us next time on Washington to Washington.